When you spend your whole life building something with love, you never imagine the people you built it for will try to take it away. I used to think my children were helping me out of care, until I realized they were preparing me to disappear. But what they didn't know was that I had one final lesson left to teach them: what a home really means. Everyone told me I was lucky to have children who cared so much. That's what the neighbors said whenever they saw my son's car parked outside. "You're blessed," they'd tell me, their smiles full of envy. "He's always there for you." And I'd smile back, because that's what mothers do. We smile even when we're not sure if something's right. At first, it felt nice, comforting even. Richard would stop by every day, carrying grocery bags I didn't ask for, telling me not to worry about bills or stress about chores. My daughter-in-law, Tina, would call constantly, checking if I'd taken my medication, offering to handle my mail or schedule appointments. They made me feel cared for, at least on the surface. But care has a strange way of feeling like control when it comes with limits. When you start noticing the fine print behind every act of kindness. It started with small things. Richard told me I shouldn't go walking alone anymore, just in case. Tina suggested that maybe I should stop driving. The roads are too busy these days. Then came the diet changes. "No more sugar, Mom," she said once, confiscating the cookies I'd baked. "It's for your health." It all sounded loving, protective, but love shouldn't feel like a leash. One afternoon, I tried visiting my friend Carol across town. I'd already called a taxi and was halfway out the door when Richard arrived unannounced. "Where are you going?" he asked, smiling, that same smile he wore when he wanted to sound gentle but stay in control. "To see Carol," I replied. He frowned. "Mom, you shouldn't be out like that. What if you get dizzy again?" "I'm fine," I said. "I just want to visit a friend." "Please," he said, taking the keys from my hand, "don't make this hard." That night, as I sat alone in my living room, I realized something I didn't want to admit. My son's concern had turned into command. The next day, Tina came over with a new bank statement and a stack of unopened mail. "You've got a lot piling up," she said cheerfully. "Let me take care of it for you. It's just easier if I handle the bills from now on." I hesitated, but she was already sorting through the envelopes. "Don't worry," she said without looking up. "We'll make sure everything's organized." Organized. That word stuck in my mind like a pebble in my shoe. I started noticing things disappearing. My checkbook, my spare house keys, my independence, one tiny piece at a time. And every time I tried to question it, Richard's voice would soften into that infuriating calm tone he used when I was a child misbehaving. "Mom, you're overthinking. We just want what's best for you." But it wasn't what's best for me. It was what was easiest for them. And I could see the plan forming, slow and careful, behind their polite smiles. One morning, while dusting the bookshelf, I found a glossy brochure tucked behind my photo albums, a pamphlet for a senior living community 2 towns over. Golden Pines, where comfort meets care. It showed happy-looking elderly people playing bingo and smiling over soup bowls. At the bottom, I saw Tina's handwriting in small blue ink, "Ask about room 12B near the window." My stomach turned cold. That afternoon, when they stopped by, I pretended not to have found it. I let them chat, laugh, check on me, the way they always did. But I noticed the looks they exchanged when I asked about my savings account. I noticed how Richard deflected with a joke, and how Tina quickly changed the subject to how peaceful Golden Pines looked. They weren't protecting me. They were preparing me to disappear quietly into a comfortable nursing home while they decided what to do with my life and my house. The thought made my hands tremble, not from fear, but from realization. The same realization that had once kept my husband awake at night, checking the locks and the bills after his heart attack. I could almost hear his voice in my head, calm but firm. "Never let anyone take away what we built, Maggie. Not even out of love." So that night, after they left, I pulled out the old metal tin from the top shelf of the pantry, the one where Arthur and I used to keep important papers. The tin was dusty, and the lid creaked, but inside were our old deeds, insurance documents, and a yellowing note in Arthur's handwriting. It simply said, "In case you ever feel pressured, call Harold Jacobs." I smiled, even as my eyes welled up. He'd known, even then, that someday I might need help, not from strangers, but from the people closest to me. So I called, and just like that, the quiet game my children had been playing was about to change. Because while they were busy planning where I'd live, I was already deciding what to do with the life. And the house they thought they controlled. The plan started subtle. So subtle, in fact, that I almost mistook it for care. Richard began collecting my mail, so I wouldn't have to strain my back. He'd show up every morning with a cheerful knock and a handful of envelopes. "No need to go outside, Mom," he'd say with that same easy smile. "You'll slip on the steps again." The first few times, I appreciated it. He even sorted the letters for me, bills in one pile, advertisements in another, until I noticed that the bills pile had been getting thinner, while the pile of envelopes he tucked under his arm as he left grew thicker each week. Then there was Tina. She was polite and polished, the kind of woman who always called me Mom, but said it like it was part of a performance. She started helping with my doctor's appointments, insisting that the hospital's online system was too complicated. "Don't worry, Mom," she'd say. "I'll handle all of it. You just rest." At first, I was grateful. I thought maybe this was what growing old gracefully meant, learning to accept help, letting the younger ones take over. But one afternoon, I overheard her on the phone. "Yeah, I've got her schedule," she was saying, her voice low but sharp. "Once the papers are signed, it'll all transfer smoothly. She won't even notice." I froze. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. She laughed softly, a sound I'd never heard from her before. "We just need her to sign one more form." That was the moment I understood. Their kindness wasn't kindness at all. It was a slow takeover, and I was the last to realize it. My husband, Arthur, would have seen it coming a mile away. He was the cautious one. He'd double-check receipts, question contracts, and keep records of everything, just in case. He'd say, I used to tease him about it, "Arthur, you act like the world's out to trick us." He'd smile and reply, "Not the world, Maggie, just the desperate ones." When he was dying, lying in that same house we built from nothing, he took my hand and said, "Promise me you'll never let anyone put you away just because you're old." I promised, and I intended to keep that promise. The house had been our dream, bought with every penny we'd scraped together. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We'd spent the first winter there, without heating, because we couldn't afford it, wrapping ourselves in blankets and laughing about it like it was an adventure. We painted those walls together, sometimes arguing over colors, but always ending the night dancing barefoot on the wooden floor. Every corner carried his memory. The creak in the third stair he never got around to fixing, the garden he used to talk to as if it could hear him, the smell of sawdust that clung to his shirts. So when Richard started leaving pamphlets about senior living communities on the kitchen counter, I knew exactly what was happening. Golden Acres, where independence meets comfort, one of them read, with a smiling woman holding a cup of tea. I flipped through the pages, my eyes skimming over phrases like medical supervision and estate assistance. I smiled, that kind of smile that hides a storm underneath. When Richard stopped by later that evening, he found me sitting at the table with the brochure open. "Ah, you saw it," he said, sounding pleased. "Isn't it nice? They have game nights, private rooms, a community garden." "It looks lovely," I interrupted softly, sipping my tea. "Maybe I'll take a look." He seemed surprised. "You will?" "Of course," I said. "You know me, always curious." That night, I called my husband's old friend, the lawyer we trusted for years, Mr. Harold Jacobs, the same one who'd helped us set up the house title decades ago. I hadn't spoken to him since Arthur's funeral, but the moment he heard my voice, his tone softened. "Margaret," he said warmly, "it's been a while. What can I do for you?" "I think my son and his wife are planning something," I said quietly, "and I want to make sure they don't get what they're after." He didn't even hesitate. "Come by tomorrow morning. Bring any papers they've given you." The next day, I went through my drawers and found every form Tina had made me sign. Medical permissions, bank authorizations, even a power of attorney form she'd slipped in for hospital emergencies. I placed them neatly into an envelope, tied my scarf, and went to see Harold. As he flipped through the papers, his eyebrows rose. "You were right to be concerned," he said. "They've been preparing a financial guardianship request. Once you sign this last one, they'd have full access to your accounts and the property." My stomach turned. "So they could sell the house?" "Yes," he said gravely, "and legally move you into care. But they haven't filed yet. We still have time." He smiled faintly. "Tell me, Margaret, how much of this do you want them to know?" "Not a word," I said. That was the moment the plan began to turn. I signed new papers, not the ones Richard and Tina wanted, but ones Harold drafted for me. A private trust that would transfer my home to a foundation if anyone ever tried to declare me unfit or move me into assisted living without my consent. As I walked home that day, the wind was cold but crisp. For the first time in months, I felt awake. When Richard visited later, he found me humming softly the same song Arthur used to play on his old record player. "You seem happy," he said cautiously. "I am," I replied. "I've been thinking maybe it's time to simplify things." "You might be right." He smiled, clearly relieved, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head, believing that victory was just around the corner. But in reality, the moment they thought I was surrendering was the moment I started fighting back. Let them think I was weak. It would make what came next that much easier. One afternoon, they invited me to lunch at their favorite restaurant, a place far too expensive for coincidence. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a holiday. It was a setup. The restaurant was one of those modern spots with gold accents, soft lighting, and waiters who spoke in whispers. Tina had chosen the table by the window where sunlight framed us like a happy family from the outside. But I knew better. They were smiling too much, talking too carefully, the kind of performance people put on when they're about to say something they know will break you. I watched them through the steam of my tea. Tina picked at her salad while Richard kept checking his watch. Their unease filled the silence like static. Finally, halfway through dessert, Richard cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his tone rehearsed, "we've been thinking." "Here it comes," I thought. "You shouldn't have to handle the stress of bills, the garden, or that old house anymore. It's just too much for you. We found a beautiful place for you, close to us." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Tina jumped in, her voice sugary sweet. "It even has a piano room. You'd love it. And they cook healthy meals. You'd finally get to relax." I looked between them, studying every twitch, every flicker of guilt behind their polite expressions. Then I asked quietly, "So, you're moving me out?" Richard hesitated, his fork clinking softly against his plate. "It's not like that," he said quickly. "It's just safer. You're alone too much. This way, you'll have people around, care, activities. It's for the best." I nodded slowly, pretending to consider it. "You're right," I said after a pause. "Maybe it's time." The relief that swept across their faces was almost comical. Tina reached for my hand. "I'm so glad you understand," she said warmly. I smiled, the same soft, motherly smile they'd grown up trusting. The kind that said, "I believe you." But inside, I was already a step ahead. They didn't know I had already been to my lawyer 2 days earlier. They didn't know the documents they'd been trying to push under my pen no longer mattered. Arthur and I had built our home 40 years ago with more love than money. Every nail in those walls had a memory, every scuff on the floor a story. When Arthur passed, I thought about selling it once, but I couldn't. I couldn't bear to see strangers walking through the living room where we danced barefoot, or sleeping in the room where he'd said goodbye. But after what my children had done, strangers suddenly didn't sound so bad, as long as they were the right kind. So when I went to Mr. Jacobs earlier that week, I made my final decision. "Are you sure?" he'd asked, his voice careful but kind. "This means your children will never be able to claim the property, even after—" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "If they see the house as a prize, they don't deserve it." He nodded, sliding the new trust across the desk for me to sign. The new arrangement was simple. The moment I moved out of my home, ownership would automatically transfer to a women's shelter foundation. The house would be turned into a refuge for mothers escaping abuse, women who needed walls that kept them safe, not trapped. As I signed the papers, I felt lighter. It was like giving the house a new life, one my children's greed could never stain. Now, sitting across from them in that restaurant, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Tina was already outlining her plans for my move. "We'll take care of the packing," she said brightly. "Don't you worry about a thing. You'll have your own suite, and they even allow pets if you ever want another cat." "That's lovely," I said, forcing a small laugh. "You've really thought of everything." Richard looked proud. "We just want what's best for you, Mom." I took another slow sip of tea. "Oh, I know," I said softly. "And I've been doing some thinking, too, about what's best for everyone." Tina perked up. "You have?" "Yes," I said. "I've made some arrangements. You don't have to worry about the house anymore." Richard leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Really? Really?" I said with a smile. "Everything's taken care of." They exchanged a satisfied glance, the kind that said, "Finally." They thought the hard part was over. But as I sat there, watching them laugh and toast to a future they didn't own, I felt a quiet kind of victory settle in my chest. Because while they were planning my exit, I had planned theirs. When the check came, Richard reached for it, all generous-like, and said, "Don't you worry, Mom. I've got it." "Oh, I know you do," I said, meeting his eyes. "You always do." He didn't notice the meaning behind my tone. He never did. That night, I went home and began packing, not for the nursing home they had chosen, but for the apartment I'd rented downtown. A small place, nothing fancy, but it had a balcony overlooking the city lights. Freedom doesn't need luxury. It just needs space to breathe. As I folded the last of my clothes, I looked around the house one final time. The pictures on the wall, the grooves on the banister, the sound of the wind rustling through the magnolia tree outside. For a moment, I felt sadness, not for losing the house, but for what it had revealed about the people I'd raised. Still, there was comfort in knowing it would soon shelter someone who truly needed it. Someone who'd walk through those same rooms not with greed, but with gratitude. I smiled as I locked the front door behind me. They thought they'd won. But what they didn't realize was that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking something back. It's giving it away to someone who deserves it more. The day they came to help me pack, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stage, and I was watching a play where I already knew the ending. Richard arrived first, sleeves rolled up, voice full of false cheer. "All right, Mom," he said, clapping his hands together. "We'll get this done in no time. Just point us to what you want to keep." Tina followed close behind, carrying boxes labeled kitchen and decor. She was efficient, almost military about it. "We should start with your bedroom," she said briskly. "Less emotional that way." I nodded politely and let them take charge. I let them open drawers, sort through photo frames, and decide what wasn't necessary. It was almost funny watching them handle the life I had built like it was clutter. They didn't see my shaking hands, not from fear, but from restraint. I kept my composure, pretending to be the frail, agreeable woman they believed me to be. They fussed and instructed and controlled, like always. But they didn't know that the real packing, the kind that mattered, had already been done days ago. My documents were gone, my valuables safely tucked away, and the heart of this house, the part that couldn't be boxed up or sold, had already been given a new purpose. As the moving van pulled into the driveway, Richard wiped his brow dramatically. "You'll love it, Mom," he said. "We even picked a room near the window for you." "Oh," I said, feigning curiosity. "That sounds wonderful." Tina smiled. "It'll be just like home, only easier. You won't have to worry about anything." "Is that so?" I asked softly, looking around the room, at the family photos, the worn-out rug Arthur used to trip over, the kitchen clock that ticked 2 seconds too slow. Then I picked up the sealed envelope from the table and handed it to Richard. "Before we go," I said sweetly, "you should take this." He frowned, turning it over in his hands. "What's this?" "Just the house documents," I said. "Everything's been taken care of." He looked relieved, maybe even proud. "Mom, that's great. Thank you. This will make everything easier." I smiled and nodded. I thought it might. They didn't question it. They didn't look at me twice. Tina hugged me quickly, a polite, distracted gesture. "You'll be so happy at Golden Pines," she said. "I'll call them to confirm your arrival. They're expecting you this evening." I nodded again, watching them carry out the last of my boxes. But none of those boxes held what they wanted. Not one piece of paper, not one signature, not one thing of value. Just old clothes, worn books, and memories they couldn't profit from. When the door closed behind them, I stood in the middle of the empty room and took a long breath. The silence was heavy, but not sad. It felt like the first moment of peace I'd had in months. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed gently in the wind, scattering a few blossoms across the porch. Arthur used to say that every time a petal fell, something old was making room for something new. I locked the door behind me one last time. By the time Richard and Tina opened that envelope later that evening, I was already gone, settled in my small apartment downtown, sipping chamomile tea as the city lights flickered outside my window. I could almost picture them sitting at their dining table, tearing open the flap, expecting a deed or a signature of surrender. Instead, they found my letter. "Dear Richard and Tina, you wanted my home so badly, you forgot what a home really means. It's not walls or money, it's heart, and you both lost yours somewhere along the way. Don't worry about the mortgage or the inheritance. The house now belongs to the Willow Shelter Foundation. They needed it more than you did. Love, Mom." I imagine the silence that must have filled that room after they read it. Tina would have gasped, maybe even cried, not from remorse but from shock. Richard, on the other hand, would have gone pale first, then red with anger. She can't do that, he'd shout, slamming the letter on the table. It's our family home. Tina, always the realist, would probably say something like, she already did. I could almost hear the sound of his chair scraping back, the thud of his footsteps pacing the floor. Maybe he even called the lawyer. Maybe he begged or threatened, but none of it mattered, because by the time he realized how carefully I'd moved, every paper had already been filed. The house's deed had been officially transferred 2 days ago, sealed, notarized, and delivered. The Willow Shelter Foundation now owned it. And by morning, they'd already begun moving in furniture, cribs, mattresses, and fresh paint. The home that once echoed with laughter, then deceit, was now filled with new voices, softer, uncertain, but grateful. I didn't need to see their faces to know it was the right choice. The next morning, as I unpacked in my new apartment, the sunlight poured through my window just like it used to at home. But this time, it felt different, warmer somehow, like freedom. I poured myself another cup of tea, opened the window, and let the city's hum fill the silence. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't someone's responsibility. I wasn't someone's burden. I was just me. The phone rang later that evening. I didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. I let it ring, smiled to myself, and whispered, "You'll figure it out someday, Richard." Then I turned the volume down and went back to my tea, because there's a certain peace in knowing you didn't just protect your home, you protected what it stood for. And maybe, just maybe, someday they'd understand what I had tried to teach them all along. That love without respect is just control. And a house without love isn't a home at all. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Richard called first, then Tina, then an unfamiliar number that could only have been their lawyer. I didn't answer any of them. I just watched the screen light up again and again, as if silence itself had become my answer. For years, I had been conditioned to respond, to soothe, to fix, to bend. But that morning, I realized I didn't owe anyone a single explanation. Instead, I made breakfast, toast, tea, and a slice of peace I hadn't tasted in decades. The apartment was small but warm, with sunlight spilling through lace curtains I'd hung myself the night before. The kettle hissed softly, and in the quiet, I felt something shift, the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't Richard. It was a message from the Willow Shelter director, a kind woman named Elisa, who had hugged me so tightly the day I signed the papers. She'd written, "They moved in this morning." Attached was a single photograph. In it, a young mother stood on my old front porch with 2 small children, a boy clutching a teddy bear, a girl in mismatched shoes. They were smiling. You could see the relief in their faces, the disbelief that they finally had somewhere safe to sleep. Behind them, I recognized the magnolia tree Arthur, and I had planted 40 years ago. It was still blooming, wide, white petals catching the morning sun, like they'd been waiting for this moment. I held the phone to my chest and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That house was finally serving its purpose again, not as a trophy for someone's greed, but as a refuge for people who truly needed it. It was home again, not mine, but theirs, and that felt right. Days turned into weeks. The calls slowed, then stopped. I started to walk every morning, exploring the small park down the street. I began baking again, reading again. For the first time since Arthur's death, I didn't feel haunted by the weight of memory. I felt guided by it. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Mothers always know the sound of their children's footsteps, no matter how old they get. Richard stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes tired. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in spirit. The arrogance, the entitlement, all of it had melted into something almost unfamiliar. Humility. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him in. He glanced around the small apartment, his gaze landing on the framed photo of his father on the wall. Arthur's smile stared back at him, calm, steady, forgiving. "You could have just told me," Richard said finally, his voice rough. "I did," I replied gently. "You just didn't listen." He swallowed hard, nodding. There was a long silence between us, filled with all the words we'd never said when it mattered. Finally, he looked up. "You really gave it away?" "I didn't give it away," I said softly. "I passed it forward." He looked confused at first, like he wanted to argue. Then his eyes drifted toward the window, where sunlight spilled across my small dining table, simple, peaceful, unpretentious. He sighed. Dad would have. He would have understood, wouldn't he? I smiled faintly. He helped me plan it. Richard blinked, startled. What do you mean? Before he passed, we talked about what the house meant to us, how it wasn't just where we lived, but what it stood for. He said one day it might help someone who needed it more. So I made sure it would. He sat down slowly, running a hand through his hair. For once, he didn't have a plan or an excuse or a reason to justify his actions. He just sat there, quiet and human. Finally, he said, I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I said, but sometimes good intentions turn into control when you forget who you're doing it for. He nodded, eyes glistening. I saw the news article. He admitted about the shelter. They said families are already moving in, kids laughing in the yard. I looked at him carefully. How did that make you feel? He exhaled slowly, like maybe you were right. I smiled, not triumphant, not bitter, just proud. Maybe someday you'll see that home isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn by how you love, how you respect, how you remember where you came from. He stood to leave, hesitating at the door. Can I visit you again? He asked. Of course, I said. Just come as my son, not my caretaker. He nodded once, eyes soft, then walked away. When the door closed, I looked out the window and saw the sun dipping behind the city skyline. Somewhere across town, in a house that used to be mine, a mother was tucking her children into bed. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't lost my home. I had simply let it grow into something bigger. It no longer belonged to me, but it still carried my heartbeat. Arthur's too. And for the first time, I didn't feel empty. I felt free. Some people measure love by what they get to keep. Others measure it by what they're willing to let go of. If this story touched your heart, take a second to like it and tell me in the comments, would you have done the same? Because sometimes the best way to teach gratitude is through loss.